All right. So, you guys sent in some really intense stuff this week.
Yeah.
Centered around this idea that the Insurrection Act could be invoked.
Mm-hmm.
And it's pretty heavy stuff. So we are going to try to unpack it all.
Yeah.
Take a deep dive into the Insurrection Act itself.
Right.
We've got an article from Waging Nonviolence, which is going to be kind of the core of what we're looking at.
Exactly. And the idea here is to, really give people a better sense of what is this thing?
Yeah.
What could happen if it's used?
Right.
And what are some things that people are suggesting we might do in response?
Yeah. So it's like, a lot of this stuff is we're talking about potential things.
Yeah.
But it's always, good to be prepared.
Absolutely.
And the real reason that this is all coming to the forefront is because there is this upcoming report
Right.
from the Secretary of Defense and Homeland Security
Mm-hmm.
due by April 20th.
Yeah.
And it's supposed to include recommendations on using the Insurrection Act to address the border.
At the southern border, yeah.
At the southern border.
The author of the piece that we'll be talking about a lot today, Daniel Hunter, he believes that it's very likely that will be one of the recommendations, and he points to President Trump's past actions and statements to support that.
Right. So, he's, definitely shown an inclination towards wanting to have more direct control.
Yeah.
So, okay, let's get into it. What is the Insurrection Act?
Yeah, so it's a little bit complicated. It's not one single law, but it's a set of statutes that fall under Title 10 of the U.S. Code.
Okay.
But they all kind of descend from this 1807 law.
And actually, the article quotes it.
Yeah.
And it's something like, in all cases of insurrection or obstruction to the laws,
Right.
the president can call forth the militia to suppress said insurrection.
Yes, and I think that's where it gets really interesting.
Right.
Because, the term insurrection is actually kind of woefully undefined.
Yeah, I was going to say, what does that actually mean?
Yeah.
What does that even mean?
Right, and the more modern language talks about unlawful obstructions, combinations, assemblages, or rebellions.
Okay.
So still very broad.
Pretty broad.
Yeah.
A lot of room for interpretation.
A lot.
And what did they say about the Supreme Court?
Yeah, so the Supreme Court has basically said that it's the president's role to determine what those terms mean.
Okay.
But that they reserve the right to review whether any military action that results is constitutional or not.
Oh, okay.
So the courts still have a role to play.
Right, so that's good.
Hopefully, they need to actually be able to, carry out that review.
Yeah, make sure it's actually constitutional.
You're right.
Okay, so one of the big things is how the Insurrection Act relates to this other thing called the Posse Comitatus Act.
Yeah, Posse Comitatus.
Which I always have trouble saying.
Yeah, me too.
But can you explain what that is?
So the Insurrection Act basically allows the president to say, okay, Posse Comitatus doesn't apply right now. And Posse Comitatus is the law that says that the military can't act as domestic law enforcement.
Okay.
Like they can't be the police.
Right.
But the Insurrection Act says that they can.
Okay.
And it's really important to keep in mind, though, that even when the Insurrection Act is invoked, the intention is that the military would be assisting civilian law enforcement, not replacing them.
Got it.
So not full-on martial law.
Okay.
Not quite.
Okay, so huge implications, but not full-blown martial law.
Right.
Okay. And they give some hypothetical situations.
They do.
Like what Trump could do if he had this authority.
Yeah, so for instance, we could see, the Army being ordered to conduct searches
Right.
for undocumented residents. We could see, the Coast Guard being told to, really step up patrols.
Okay.
We could even see things like Marines being deployed to shut down protests.
Wow, okay. So
Otherwise legal.
That's pretty intense.
Yeah, and it's really important to note that all of these things could still be challenged in federal court.
Okay.
So it's not like, this gives unlimited power.
So there are still checks and balances.
Right, there are still checks and balances.
Yeah.
But it's something to really consider.
Yeah, and this is not, like some old dusty law that's never been used.
No.
It has been used in the past.
Yeah, it has been used in the past in a variety of different circumstances.
Like when?
So, Lincoln, during the Civil War.
Oh, wow.
Right, against the Ku Klux Klan, Johnson, to enforce school desegregation.
Oh, okay.
And even, George H.W. Bush during the L.A. riots.
Wow. So, all very different.
Very different.
Like all across the spectrum.
Right. And that's part of what makes legal experts so concerned.
Right.
Because it's so wide open to potential abuse.
Right. It's like all over the place.
Yeah.
Okay. So we kind of have a better grasp now of what the Insurrection Act is.
Yeah.
But then the article moves into this other thing.
Like, okay, what could Trump actually do?
Yeah, what might this look like?
Yeah, and they pull from this simulation.
They do.
Can you tell us about that?
So about, 10 months before the author wrote this piece, they participated in this tabletop exercise
Okay.
that was organized by the Brennan Center for Justice.
Uh-huh.
And one of the scenarios that they played out was President Trump invoking the Insurrection Act on his first day in office,
Wow.
with the stated goals of securing the border and assisting ICE with, arresting undocumented immigrants across the country.
Wow.
So they really walked through step by step how all of this might actually play out.
So was this just like academics or something? Or
No. It
was
was
involved in this?
political strategists, former military officials,
Oh, wow.
people who actually have experience with these things.
Okay.
And they really, meticulously played out how orders might be issued, how they might be carried out.
So was it like sheer chaos?
It sounds like it.
Yeah.
Yeah, the author describes it as sheer chaos.
But that there were also some very important lessons that emerged from it.
Okay, good. Well, let's get to the lessons.
Yeah.
So what was kind of like the initial reaction from the military?
Right. So the military actually balked
Okay.
when the order came down for widespread door-to-door raids to find undocumented immigrants.
Oh, wow.
The people playing military leaders raised serious concerns.
Yeah. Okay.
About having, military personnel, many of whom have experience in war zones,
Oh,
interacting with civilians in this way,
yeah.
especially without, a strong understanding of constitutional rights.
Yeah, I mean, that's
And they thought it would be very likely.
like a recipe for disaster.
Exactly.
Okay, so there was pushback.
Yeah.
Did they try to slow things down?
So Northcom, which is, responsible for Homeland Defense,
Uh-huh.
received this order and sent it to JAG as kind of a delaying tactic.
Okay.
And surprisingly, JAG approved it pretty quickly.
Oh.
So then Northcom claimed that they didn't have, adequate plans in place to actually carry out the full-scale operation
Interesting.
that Trump had envisioned.
So were they willing to do anything?
So they said that they would deploy troops to the border itself,
Okay.
but that they didn't want those troops interacting with civilians.
Okay, so kind of like a symbolic show of force?
Right. But it was a win for Trump,
Right.
in the simulation at least.
Okay, but that wasn't good enough for him.
No.
What did he try to do?
So in response to this reluctance, Trump, tried to reorganize the military command structure
Okay.
so that he would have the authority to directly command, National Guard units,
Yeah.
specific parts of the Army.
And how long did that take?
So that took some time.
Okay.
And there were further delays when mid-level military officials raised concerns about, how they would pay for this.
Right.
They were concerned about the funding.
Yeah, because that's a huge operation.
Right.
Undertake.
And so those officials in the simulation were fired.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And so then what happened?
So the troops were eventually ordered to coordinate with ICE,
Okay.
but their role was largely confined to surveillance.
Okay, so they weren't actually arresting people. They were just kind of watching.
Right. And the simulation actually portrayed it as being somewhat ineffective.
So just kind of like there,
Right.
but not actually doing much.
Right.
Okay, so then it gets to militias.
Yeah. So that's where things took a really dark turn.
Right.
In the simulation, Trump then decided to deputize right-wing militias
Oh, wow.
to assist on the border.
Okay.
And they ended up shooting 8 people crossing the border.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah.
And so then what happened?
So then a video of this incident was leaked,
Okay.
and it triggered this huge public outcry.
Okay.
And the courts, which had been very slow to respond up to this point,
Yeah.
suddenly kicked into gear.
Okay.
And so in response to all of this public backlash, Trump, quietly fired the militia,
Okay.
but still publicly claimed, that their efforts were a great success and returned to using the trained military.
Right. Okay. So what are kind of the big takeaways from all of this?
Yeah, so a couple of things. The first was that the courts were largely ineffective at first
Cool.
in terms of slowing down any executive action.
Yeah.
They only really started doing something after there were clear constitutional violations that were brought to public attention.
Got it.
The second was that Trump consistently asserted, broad, almost unlimited powers,
Right.
but that his ability to actually implement the most extreme things that he wanted to do
Yeah.
was constrained by a couple of things.
Okay.
One was the military's reluctance,
Okay.
and the other was, this significant public outrage.
So like he was pushing the boundaries.
Yeah.
And then he would get some pushback.
Exactly.
You have to kind of like.
Yeah, and the simulation didn't explore what would happen beyond that point. So,
Wow. Food for thought.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's like a really interesting
Right.
like view into what could actually happen. And then the article moves into this other thing.
Right.
Okay, what do we do?
What are we to do?
What are we to do?
Yeah.
So what does the author suggest?
So they start off by, kind of reflecting on their own predictions
Uh,
and saying that they were actually surprised
okay.
that Trump hadn't used the Insurrection Act sooner.
Okay.
They then talk about like a worst case
That's
scenario
okay.
where invoking the act is just a prelude to broader restrictions and the use of the military against, anyone who's protesting.
Right.
But they seem less convinced that that's going to happen right away,
Okay.
pointing to the fact that the administration has been very disorganized in the past.
Yeah.
So they're not really sure how realistic that is.
Okay. So what do they think is going to happen?
So they think that the initial focus is going to be on operational control of the southern border
Okay.
rather than, a nationwide mass deportation effort
Okay.
or targeting anyone who's against Trump.
Okay.
So a much more limited scope, at least at first. But, they do emphasize that the border is going to bear the brunt of this.
Right, even though it's already pretty heavily militarized.
Exactly.
Okay, so what else?
So the author also points out that Trump, has a clear desire to criminalize dissent.
Okay.
They point to things like ICE detaining green card holders
Wow.
for exercising free speech,
Wow.
attempts to criminalize protesting in D.C.,
Uh-huh.
and, the FBI's focus on labeling certain movements as domestic terrorism.
Right.
So there's this real concern that he's trying to create a climate of fear.
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot of things to point to.
Right.
And, it kind of seems like a slippery slope.
It does.
It's like, what if he uses it for the border
Right.
and then expands it?
Right. That's the big concern.
Okay.
That, a limited use at first could then be followed by him trying to find a violent incident.
Oh, like create a situation?
Yeah.
So he could...
That he can then use as a pretext to expand its scope. Yeah. So there's this worry that he might try to like egg on counter protesters
Uh-huh.
or even employ agent provocateurs.
Oh, so like people who look like they're on one side,
Right.
but they're really...
They're really working for the other side
Oh, wow.
to instigate violence
Yeah.
at protests.
And then he can be like, look how violent these people are.
Exactly. And they call this, a classic part of the authoritarian playbook.
Right. So what can people do in response to all this?
So the author really emphasizes the importance of projecting calm,
Okay.
of communicating a clear commitment to order and nonviolence,
Okay.
and of using positive messaging
Yeah.
to try to counter the fear.
Okay.
So, they suggest things like mass dancing or symbolic protests.
Okay.
They reference the Sunrise Movement's actions as being good examples of this,
Okay.
just to try to, reduce the fear and show that people are committed to peaceful action.
Right.
And they draw a parallel to, how Slobodan Milosevic in Serbia used paramilitary violence as a deliberate way
Oh, wow.
to justify military crackdowns.
So like set up a situation where
Right. Where he could then
I
say,
had to respond.
yes, exactly.
fine.
And they call for unity across, the widest possible coalition
Yeah.
with, a very swift and unified condemnation
Right.
of any state-sanctioned violence and making it clear that violence is the primary source of disorder
Right.
and framing it as a violation of basic freedoms.
Yeah.
With the message of we want peace, we want freedom,
Yeah.
we reject violence,
Okay.
and we reject Trump's attempts to divide us.
Yeah. So kind of like taking the moral high ground.
Exactly.
Okay. And then they talk about these 3 strategies
Right.
for public pressure.
Right. From a political strategist, Anat Shankar-Osorio.
Okay. And what are they?
Refusal, resistance, and ridicule.
Okay. So what does refusal look like?
So the article acknowledges that trying to get military personnel to refuse orders is very, very difficult
Right.
because of the hierarchical nature of the military.
Yeah.
They do say that some officers might try to gum up orders
Okay.
to try to slow things down or make things more complicated.
Okay.
And they emphasize the importance of veterans and other people who have connections to the military
I agree.
talking to people in the military
Yes.
and trying to, influence them.
Okay.
And they also point out this interesting thing about the National Guard,
Yeah.
that a governor can activate the National Guard for a specific purpose.
Okay.
And then the federal government can't take control of them for that same purpose.
Oh.
So, they suggest that governors could preemptively activate their National Guard,
Okay.
even without a federal order,
Got it.
for things like, natural disaster response,
Okay.
to prevent them from being used for, immigration enforcement.
Oh, wow. That's really interesting.
So they specifically talk about Democratic governors
Okay.
in border states,
Yeah.
like California, New Mexico, Arizona, potentially doing this before that April 20th deadline.
Okay, so it's like a preemptive
Yeah,
strike.
exactly.
Interesting. Okay. And then what about resistance?
So the article points out that, there's already been a huge amount of resistance,
Yeah.
with protest numbers in 2025 more than double what they were in 2017.
Wow. Okay.
They suggest that resistance efforts should include, updating Know Your Rights training,
Okay.
specifically for interacting with the military,
Yeah.
to emphasize protest laws and the fact that military personnel may not have a good understanding of constitutional rights.
Yeah, they might not know the ins and outs of that.
Exactly. And documenting everything is really important,
Right.
especially through video,
Mm-hmm.
both for self-protection
Yeah.
in case of potential legal cases and also to, fuel public outrage.
Right.
They use the example of the Portland protests in 2020
Oh, yeah.
as an example of, how extreme things can get
Right.
and how the administration might try to create this narrative that protesters are violent.
Yeah.
And so they say, the message should be, we are not violent. Trump is.
Right. It's coming from the top.
Right.
Okay. And so what else do they suggest?
So they also say that governors could, activate their National Guard,
Okay.
but do it for things like housing and affordability crises
Right.
instead of for border security.
Oh, okay. So use them for good.
Yeah, use them for good.
Got it.
And, they caution against rushing to mass protests right away
Okay.
if the order is very narrowly targeted.
Yeah.
Because it could backfire
Yeah.
given, existing public perceptions about border security.
Right. Like some people might think it's a good idea.
Exact.
Okay. And then this ridicule thing,
Yeah, ridicule.
which honestly, out of the three, seems like the most interesting.
The author seems really excited about this one.
Yeah.
They say that ridicule is a really underutilized but potentially powerful tool
Okay.
for dealing with oppression or when you're facing overwhelming fear.
So like using humor
Right, exactly.
to combat.
Yeah, and they point to things like, the satirical ads mocking Elon Musk
Sure.
or, other humorous online content
Yeah.
as examples of how this can be effective.
Got it.
But they think there's a lot more potential to use humor strategically in this context.
Okay. So why is ridicule so important?
So first of all, humor is important for morale,
Okay.
for keeping people's spirits up
Yeah.
when they're dealing with something really scary or stressful.
Yeah.
The other thing is that it can be a really good way to undermine the image of strength and invincibility
Right.
that authoritarians often try to project.
Right. So like making them look silly.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. And I know there are some examples of this
Yeah,
from history.
yeah. There's this group called the Clandestine Insurgent Rebel Clown Army.
That's amazing.
They use, clownish behavior as a way to disrupt and kind of make people think
Right.
about what's going on.
Okay.
And then in Russia, when traditional protests were suppressed, activists organized a toy protest.
A toy protest. What is that?
Yeah, they used Lego figures and other toys.
Oh, wow.
And so the police ended up, arresting inanimate objects.
That's kind of hilarious.
Yeah, it was very absurd.
Okay.
And then there's this Serbian group, Otpor.
Okay.
They were accused of being terrorists,
Uh-huh.
so they responded by staging terrorist fashion shows.
Terrorist fashion shows.
Yeah, where they just wore, everyday clothes.
Oh, my God.
And then after their offices were raided,
Uh-huh.
they held a reopening,
Oh.
but they just had a moving van full of empty boxes
Oh, gosh.
to show that the authorities had taken nothing of value.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Okay, so what kind of ridicule strategies are they suggesting for the Insurrection Act?
So they had a lot of ideas.
Okay.
One was to organize Tesla test drives with people dressed as clowns.
Okay.
Another was to stage toy protests along the border.
Okay.
They also suggested, having people show up after the act is invoked
Yeah.
with empty boxes that are labeled insurrection.
Well, that's good.
And they even suggested a more ironic approach.
Oh.
Which is to have a campaign of really enthusiastic support for Trump.
Oh, okay.
Put out press releases
Oh.
saying that you're delighted.
That he's finally going after insurrectionists.
Right.
Oh.
And the implication being that, he should nullify his pardons of the January 6th people
Right.
and maybe even turn himself in.
Okay.
So just really highlighting, the hypocrisy.
The hypocrisy of it
That's
all.
all.
Okay, and how would they actually do that?
So they suggested, street theater
Okay.
with images of Trump alongside people who were involved in January 6th
Right.
and signs that say, we're with Trump, get the real insurrectionists.
Oh, my God.
And another idea was to go to the border
Okay.
and hand military officers maps.
Uh-huh.
But the maps clearly point to Washington, D.C.
Oh, that's great.
as the location of the real insurrectionists.
Yeah.
So, creating a moment of absurdity and
Yeah.
making people question,
Yeah.
why are they here?
Yeah, why are you here? Why are you focused on these people
Yeah.
when the real insurrectionists are over there?
Okay.
And the goal here is to create a contrast
Okay.
between, law-abiding, undocumented individuals
Yeah.
who are part of communities
Mm-hmm.
and the lawless cabal
Right.
who were involved in January 6th.
And who Trump seems to be supporting.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
And, the author believes that this kind of contrast can be really effective in generating public outrage
Okay.
and shifting public opinion.
So they do say, though, that ridicule alone won't prevent bad things from happening.
Right, but they argue that it can be really important for shaping the narrative
Yeah.
and stoking public outrage,
Okay.
which can then lead to more action down the road.
Got it.
So they say, it's not just about the Insurrection Act itself.
Yeah.
It's about upholding the rule of law,
Mm-hmm.
fostering mutual respect,
Yeah.
and countering this climate of fear that Trump is
Yeah.
trying to create, right? Like the bigger picture.
Right.
Okay, well, that was a lot.
Yeah.
Let's kind of recap the main points.
Yeah. So, the Insurrection Act itself is very vague.
Right.
And has a lot of potential for abuse.
Yeah.
The simulation suggests that the military might be reluctant
Uh-huh.
to carry out the most extreme orders.
Yeah.
But that public reaction is going to be really important.
Right.
And then we have these 3 strategies for public pressure.
Refusal, resistance,
And ridicule.
And ridicule.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's really important to, understand these things and
Yeah.
be prepared.
So for you, the listener,
Yeah.
as you're thinking about all this,
Yeah.
which of these strategies resonates most with you?
Right.
And how might you apply those ideas in your own way?
Yeah, even in small actions.
Yeah.
It's amazing how even small things.
Can contribute.
Yeah. And, unexpected or humorous approaches can sometimes be the most powerful
Yeah.
in shifting the narrative.
Right. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
Yeah. Thanks for listening.